Welcome to the Bookman's Corner. I'm your host, Lois Lindstrom. We have a very exciting show today, and it could be ripped from today's newspaper headlines. Our guest author is Roy Beck, who is the president of the bipartisan Numbers USA Education and Research Foundation, which is trying to educate Americans on how to fix the broken immigration enforcement system in the United States. Also, Roy Beck wrote our featured book titled Back of the Hiring Line, a 200-year history of immigration surges, employer bias, and depression of black wealth. Roy, welcome to our show.
Thank you, Lois.
Roy is a graduate of the University of Missouri School of Journalism and was the chief Washington correspondent of the Booth chain daily newspapers during the consideration and passage of the 1990 Immigration Act. In his latest book, Back of the Hiring Line, Roy writes that the average black household wealth in the 21st century is only a fraction of the wealth of other racial and ethnic groups, including recent immigrants. Stay tuned, because Roy Beck has the answers to many questions about mass immigration, illegal immigration, and the future of America. Roy, what inspired you to write the book, Back of the Hiring Line?
Well, back in the end of 2020, the Census Bureau came out with statistics on the median income, on median black wealth and white wealth, I should say. And at that point, they said that the median white wealth was about $170,000 per household. Ooh. Whereas the median black wealth, net wealth, was less than $10,000.
Oh my gosh.
So that meant half of all black households had net wealth less than $10,000. It was about 6% that of all white wealth. That's a tremendous income disparity or wealth disparity. And that was at the end of 2020 when we had all the uproar and reaction to the, you'll recall, the police incidents, the protests. And I looked at that, and I knew that the wealth disparity was great. I did not know it was that great.
That's dramatic. That's dramatic. Now, what about the Hispanic wealth?
Well, the Hispanic wealth, and most Hispanics in this country, the vast majority, their families have been in the country only in the last 50 years.
Okay.
And yet their median household wealth is twice as high as the descendants of slavery.
Okay.
So this, and then when you get into Asian wealth, it's even higher than white wealth.
Sure.
So and most Asian population are fairly recent as well.
Yes.
And the key thing here is that, I knew that it's not just the police incidents that would create that kind of burning passion in these communities. That the fuel of that was this wealth disparity. And I also knew that what was happening that year is that we've had kind of an explosion since then of people wanting to dig out more about black history. And I was aware from my work about 30 years ago, actually, that there's a part of black history related to immigration and its effect on black wealth that really is not known. And I determined then, okay, I'm going to spend 2021 digging this story out,
and I'm
putting
glad
it
you
together.
did. I mean, as the CEO of the anti-immigration group Numbers USA, can you tell us how many illegal immigrants are now in the United States since President Trump left office?
With the new administration, there's been a great reduction of enforcement, and it looks like as many as 2 million extra people have crossed over and been allowed to stay.
Okay.
Now, not all of them came illegally. A lot of them turned themselves in, asked for asylum. The way that the law has generally worked is you were detained until your asylum requests were determined to be somewhat likely to be approved. Then you would be allowed in. But what's happened is rather than being detained, hundreds of thousands have been allowed to come on in, be given work permits. Most of these people we know will have their asylum requests turned down, but will they ever leave the country?
Exactly, that's the question. And getting back to your book, I mean, why is the average black American household wealth in the 21st century only a fraction of the wealth of other racial and ethnic groups? I mean, why is it so bad?
Yeah, because you think, look, it's been over 150 years since the end of slavery. Yes. It's been over 50 years since the 60s Civil Rights Acts. It's been over 50 years since affirmative action came in place. For African Americans who have college degrees, affirmative action has been very, very helpful.
Okay.
But for the real problem here, and the reason that black median wealth is so low, is that African Americans without a college degree have been left behind over the last 50 years. At the very same time that the full political rights were given, Congress passed the 1965 Immigration Act that renewed mass immigration. After 40 years of having low immigration, mass immigration, and the loose labor markets, and that's what my book is about, how the loose labor markets hold down income for the lower skilled people.
Lower skilled people. And then, you wrote there is indifference on Capitol Hill to the effects of immigration on Native Black Americans. I mean, also the federal government's policies over the years encouraged massive surges of foreign workers, which meant black workers were ignored and not hired. Please tell us more.
Well, of course, actual anti-black racism is a part of this. That's why part of the subtitle is about employer bias. Unfortunately, employers in general, not all employers, if offered immigrant workers as opposed to the non-college degree black workers, they tend to prefer the immigrant workers. And there's all kinds of reasons for that, which I don't really get into a lot, other than that generally you can get more eager people who are just arriving as immigrants, and also you can tend to get be able to pay less wages for. But the black workers, it's not just black workers that are hurt by this. The underclass of all ethnic groups is hurt, but black workers hurt by far the most.
And of course, the education system, I mean, people that maybe don't even get a high school degree, they're really doomed, aren't they? I mean, there aren't any technical training schools for people.
Well, yeah, and there are plenty of jobs. This is the thing, it's right now. There are plenty of jobs out there that need people who actually don't have a lot of education. It's not, but those jobs, the wages, the real wages, inflation-adjusted wages, have gone down, down, down over the last 50 years.
Yes.
But at this moment, only one out of every 3 African-American men without a high school degree is working.
Oh, wow.
One of every 3. This is of working-age men who are not institutionalized. That's a pretty big recipe for problems, especially when people are concentrated in communities where there's a lack of work.
Exactly. Well, President Biden and a host of liberal groups and even Republican politicians support comprehensive immigration reforms that will offer amnesty to millions of illegal aliens currently in the United States. I mean, do you believe non-U.S. citizens should be given amnesty? And if they are given amnesty, will that mean that they'll be able to vote in American elections?
Yes, well, just about all the amnesty proposals give you a path to citizenship, and once you're a citizen, everybody can vote. Our organization, one of our principles is that every immigrant, as a person, that immigrant is actually a legal term, which means you've come legally, you've been invited, should have all should be treated the same as anybody else. It doesn't matter where you're born.
Okay.
So once you become a citizen, then if you've gotten amnesty, you should be treated the same as everybody else. But yes, you get the right to vote. Here's the problem about most amnesties. We had a huge amnesty in 1986. We had 5 more smaller amnesties in the 90s. Every one of the amnesties did nothing to stop more people from getting here illegally and then asking for another amnesty.
Well, it encourages people to come here illegally, don't you think?
And the reason they come, most of them come, is for the jobs.
Of course.
They don't come here for the welfare. They don't come here to steal or hurt people. They come here for the jobs. It's very logical on their part, but our government has refused for the last 30 years to pass mandatory E-Verify, which would require every employer to make sure somebody was here legally to get a job.
And your group is supporting that, right?
To us, that's the number one way you fight illegal immigration, is to just take away the jobs.
Yes, yes, yes. And then according to a report published by the Miami Herald newspaper, many illegal aliens are members of drug cartels, and they're rapists, and some are murderers. I mean, there are also reports of terrorists trying to sneak across our borders and perhaps launch attacks on our streets. I mean, it's worrisome. What can be addressed? How can this be addressed by the federal government?
Well, first of all, It is, of course, a tiny proportion of people who are here illegally that,
But how do
that
you
come to hurt us, but some do. There's no question some do. And number one, they're able to stay here because they or members of their family are able to get jobs. That helps hold them.
Okay.
Number two, because we have such a huge invitation for people to not just come across the border illegally, but overstay their visas. Up until recently, the majority of illegal aliens in this country came legally, but they overstayed their visas. They didn't go home like they promised. So how do you keep that huge number from coming? Well, you tell them you won't have jobs. Because there's so many people coming, then the really what you call bad people can mix themselves in with all of them. If we didn't have hundreds of thousands of people a month trying to come here illegally to get jobs, the Border Patrol would have far fewer to chase. So the bad guys that are coming, they'd be much more likely to catch
So
them.
do we need more people than in the enforcement sector of the government? Do we need more people enforcing?
We do, but again, everything is destined to fail until we turn off the jobs magnet.
So the E-Verify is so critical for people. They have to have that before they get a job. They have to be able to be verified, right?
By the employer. It's been around since the 90s. Over 50% of all new hires go through it now. It's voluntary. That's the problem. But guess what? The people who intend to break the law don't volunteer to use it.
No, of course, of course. Well, let's discuss sanctuary jurisdictions, which are cities, counties, and states that prohibit local police from cooperating with federal immigration authorities on issues regarding the incarceration and deportation of criminal illegal aliens. Is your group, Numbers USA, using the courts to challenge and overturn more than 500 sanctuary jurisdictions in our country?
We're not involved in the courts. There are other organizations do, but we definitely have worked and mobilized our grassroots members to fight these sanctuary policies. They are part of the reason for what you were describing a minute ago. Even when people are caught, convicted, jailed for committing these crimes, right now, over the last couple of years, they are not being deported whenever they end up serving their sentences.
Well, should people be writing their members of Congress about this? I mean, what would you say? What could you say?
Well, that is what they can do, and I started in 1996 at the end of my, believe it or not, my last book tour was in 96. I started this organization in part to make it easy for people to do that. So when people come to numbersusa.com, they can sign up for free. We help them know how to reach their members of Congress, what kind of messages they may want to send. They can decide for themselves. But wherever people are, they need to talk to their own members of Congress.
So you have the sanctuary jurisdictions on your website. Then
do.
Okay, very cool, very cool. Well, I read in your book that before the passage of the Immigration Act of 1965, only 44,000 immigrants were admitted into the country as relatives, mostly spouses and children of immigrants who had been admitted for their special skills. And then 5 years later, in 1970, the annual number of foreign relatives jumped from 44,000 to 172,000. And in 1980, nearly 370,000 new immigrants were given a time work permit because they had relatives from previous immigrants. I mean, explain how this new chain of migration greatly increased the number of immigrants in the same occupations as African Americans.
Yeah, and now the number, by the way, of relatives that are coming in like that is close to 500,000 a year.
Oh my gosh.
And it's often called chain migration because you get into the country based on a skill or because you were accepted as a refugee. And then the law allows them to immediately bring in spouse and minor children, and then parents, and you petition for your brothers and sisters, your adult brothers and sisters, your adult children. Each of them are able to bring their spouses. The point is that the chains never stop. Now there are annual limits in each of these, and that's why it's not over 500,000. There's something like 4 million people standing in line.
Right now.
Yes. Now there's nothing wrong with these people that are coming. It's not the character, the characteristics of those people, but it's the numbers. And the fact is, it's these 500,000 people are being brought in without any indication of what their skills are or whether they're needed in the labor market. They come in And again, the people who are last in line, which are the non-college degree African Americans, descendants of slavery, now they have to compete directly in these markets,
And that really that really dampens wages way down.
Wages are dampened, and the workforce participation drops.
Well, you know, it was interesting to read in your book that John F. Kennedy's book, A Nation of Immigrants, had huge unintended consequences. I mean, did Kennedy advocate a revival of mass immigration in his book? And what was the impact of Kennedy's book?
Yes, well, the impact was that he wrote the book, and then he got assassinated. And people began looking for ways to honor this slain president. And they picked up on this book. It's like what his book wanted to do was to end it wasn't really racial considerations in the 1924 Immigration Act, but it was by continent. Basically, the 1924 Act dropped immigration dramatically to under a couple 100,000 a year.
Yes.
But they also determined who could come, and you almost couldn't come if you were from Southern Europe or Eastern Europe, and you definitely couldn't come
if you were from Africa. Right?
If you're from Africa or if you're from Asia.
Okay.
It was a little different from Latin America. So there was a racial impact of that. What Kennedy wanted to do was to change the who, not the how many. And when the Congress enacted the change in 1965, all of the major sponsors, that included his two brothers who were senators, Senator McCarthy, Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota, they all said this will not increase the numbers.
Yes.
Now my book goes through all of this, and I conclude that it was an accident. I really do conclude they did not intend to increase the numbers. But in fact, it ended up almost immediately doubling the overall numbers.
Oh, yeah.
They just misjudged everything. And it was indifference because, as the economic, or the labor economists have said, nobody in Congress invited any labor economists to say, what would this do to the labor market?
Exactly. How would that affect it? Yeah. Because, I mean, I was interested to read in your book about the janitorial services in California. I mean, from an estimated 2,500 black janitors in California that were earning wages equivalent to $30 an hour in the 1970s, only 600 were left in their jobs by 1985, and with just 10 of them, with 100 of them earning union wages. I mean, what happened to the janitorial services?
Yeah, we saw this happen in one occupation after another. What happened there was that we had so much both legal and illegal immigration, primarily from Mexico at that point, that businesses, janitorial businesses, rose up, hiring these people at very low wages, and then they were able to offer contracts. The governments, the businesses, they put out the bids. Well, the lowest bids came from the companies that had the foreign workers working for them, whether they're legal or illegal. Whereas the previous contractors were they had union workers, which were predominantly black workers.
And they were in the middle class with those wages, but then
the unions collapsed.
They
collapsed. Those businesses, they went out of business.
Yes.
Now this happened in the meat packing industry, happened in one industry after another. One of the things I try to emphasize throughout the book, this is not the fault of the immigrants. I mean, they're just taking jobs, and if they came here legally, they did nothing wrong.
Right.
But the officials, without looking at the number, which is the key thing here, have made this happen.
Yeah, it's the federal government is not managing it properly. Well, why did black workers disappear in New York, Washington, D.C., and Miami? I'm referring to your paragraph which states that the black employment rate dropped 36% from 1965 to 2000. Why?
Well, everything we've just been talking about and more. I have to say that in the 40 years prior to the renewal of mass immigration in 1965, you had the greatest economic advancement of blacks in our history.
And they were in the middle class.
Most of them were in the middle class. But it's just the labor markets became flooded. And so, again, it was employer bias, but it's also employers have to, they've got to compete with each other.
Yeah.
And if their competitor is able to undercut them with lower wages, they've got to either lower their wages or hire somebody else. And in the end, African Americans, by this point, the civil rights movement had told African Americans, you deserve to be paid like Americans. You deserve to work like Americans, have benefits like Americans. So you've got two things going on here, and one of them is a lot of African Americans say, you know what, you've lowered this job below what I'm willing to take.
Okay, okay. Because, I mean, you say that, you know, so many Black Americans are shut out by ethnic immigrant networking. I mean, what is ethnic immigrant networking? Because they only will, like a Hispanic-owned business will only hire Hispanics, right? And they won't hire anyone else, right?
Well, a Chinese restaurant.
A Chinese restaurant, only, yeah.
I mean, let's think of a Chinese restaurant. It makes absolute sense, doesn't it? If your language, your main language is not English, you're going to like hiring people that you can talk your native language with, often their family. Ethnic networking is totally natural. It happens all over the world. The problem is that the civil rights laws that were against discrimination against blacks were not enforced against ethnic networking. So that immigrants were able to start companies, and they start lots of companies, lots of small businesses, but also bigger businesses. And because of the special circumstances, the government, the federal government, did not prosecute and force the ethnic-owned companies, the immigrant-owned companies, to hire Black Americans in the way that it did other Americans.
That's so interesting. Now, you also say that how is affirmative action being used by employers to avoid hiring native-born Black Americans? I was shocked to read that during the 1980s, a construction company owned by a Portuguese immigrant was the biggest beneficiary of minority set-aside contracts worth millions of dollars that were supposed to be intended to give a boost to Black-owned businesses, but it went to a white European.
Well, yes. And of course, that's the worst part. You'll see that people who, by any other standard, you say, well, this is a white European kind of descendant. But at that point, being Portuguese was considered to be, that was an ethnic group. And this is the distortion of affirmative action. Now, this is a very controversial, very argument. People can make arguments on this on all sides. My contention is, I agree with those who say affirmative action was set up to address and to redress the slavery and Jim Crow, our own apartheid system that we had in this country. But almost immediately, companies and universities, and you name it, were able to count people who had just arrived from anywhere as the same as if they were a descendant of slavery.
But the government should have stopped that.
But they didn't, and it's still true today. Although the government has, because Asians have done so well, have tended to push a lot of Asians out of the affirmative action. But it still is. This is a big point of contention in the African American community. Almost most of whom are descendants of slavery. They're going, wait a minute. Affirmative action was supposed to be
helping us. Yeah, so why is this not helping us? Well, there's a lot of false information out there. I mean, I read in your book that the federal government believes that field work in the United States should be done only by foreigners who would accept wages and working conditions that no American would accept. But this is incorrect because there is an eye-opening report from the Blue Ribbon U.S. Commission on Agricultural Workers that refutes that theory. Can you tell us more?
Well, anytime we're talking about, especially illegal immigration, people say, well, they do jobs Americans won't do. And you always think of the field work. And it's pretty hard to get Americans, native-born Americans, to go into field work. The point is, though, before this big mass, most field work was being done by native-born Americans. And in the eastern United States, it was mainly being done by African Americans who were making far more in today's wages than people are making today. What we know is that there are, from this Agriculture Commission, there are far more agriculture workers in the country than there are jobs.
Okay.
Now, I shouldn't say jobs. Then there are hours of work in a year. Okay. The big problem is you can't make a living in agriculture work because you can't work all year long.
Well, how did the congressional decisions to encourage mass immigration since 1965 radically change life in LA for Black Native Americans?
Well, a lot of Americans are really aware now that weren't aware a few years ago of the Great Migration of Southern blacks. I think almost all you need to know is that in 1910, about 90% of all former slaves are still living, and their descendants were still living in the South, about 90%.
Okay.
Most of them on or near the plantations where they'd been enslaved.
Wow.
Now, why was that? Well, if you go through the history, it was because the North was filled with new workers from Europe.
Yeah, right.
The manufacturers shipped them in, and that's what happened. But once Congress lowered immigration, dramatically lowered it in 1924, the Northern industrials sent recruiters throughout the South, and you had this massive, for 40 years, massive movement, about 6 million African Americans out of the South, moved west, moved north.
Okay.
Now, but then in 65, as I say, inadvertently, accidentally, Congress reopened it. And in Los Angeles, as a case study, Los Angeles was a mecca of, like Harlem was, it was a mecca of black entertainment, black culture, black middle class, black businesses. And what we saw in the early 90s with the Rodney King thing, all of a sudden America fixated on South Central Los Angeles,
That's right.
which had been controlled by the descendants of slavery. But they had lost their political power, they'd lost their economic power, and we just saw what happens.
They were very upset, yeah.
Well, of course they were upset, and they'd elected a black mayor,
Yes.
but never since, and maybe never again.
Exactly, exactly. Well, it was interesting to read that economist Elizabeth Morgan wrote in her book, Immigration in New York, there are tens of thousands of jobs in New York City for which the native-born African Americans are not candidates. I mean, young Africans who sought jobs at dozens of immigrant businesses don't have any success. And
That's some tremendous sociological work that she did and others, and it's, again, this is the bias. And by the way, it's not. This is the complicated thing. It's not just race, because black immigrants from the Caribbean and Africa do not have the same issue. So there's a cultural aspect to this as well. That employers, there's obviously a different culture of people who've just arrived as immigrants from Ghana than there is from fifth generation, 10th generation African Americans who came out of slavery, Jim Crow, et cetera. But the fact is ethnic networking is a big part of this, all kinds of reasons. But we look at these cities that sometimes start burning,
yes,
and rage, and this comes out of hopelessness, because you've got generations now since 1965 in which, especially thinking about young black men who do not see
opportunity.
They don't see rungs on the ladder. They don't see the first rungs of the ladder.
That's right.
They have no idea that they could climb to higher rungs.
Yeah, it's a very sad situation, yeah. We're coming to an end here, Roy, but I just want to ask you one quick question. What has been the reaction to your book from African Americans?
Well, that's been very rewarding. It turns out that I'm old enough that maybe I shouldn't blame it on age, but there's all kinds of things going online. There's something called Twitter Spaces, where you have these long conversations. But it turns out that there's a lot of these conversations going online in African American groups, especially ones that identify themselves as freedmen, that is, the descendants of American slavery.
Okay.
And they're reviewing my book. They're playing excerpts of the audio book.
Okay.
And I was asked at one point to, after a lot of this is going on, would I come on and take questions and answers? And they said it'd be about 2 hours. So that's longer than this one. It lasted 6 hours.
Whoa.
6 hours.
A lot of questions.
And then 2 days later, they said, well, couldn't it come on again? We had some more questions. Had 7 hours
Okay.
on the thing. But anyway, there's a lot of podcasts. There's a lot, as it turns out. My book is not, for the most part, introducing this subject to them. It is confirming, they say,
what they
this
already
is
knew.
what we believe, but nobody's listening to us.
Exactly. And that's my next question. Where can our viewers find your book to purchase it?
Well, as usual, they can find it at Amazon. It's there. And also, we have a website, backofthehiringline.com, which tells you all the different ways you can get it.
Well, Roy, thank you so much for being a guest on the Bookman's Corner.
Thank you for having me.
Really appreciate it. And thank you so much for watching. Please join us again next month for a new edition of the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom.